SwayamPrabha. Digital India. Educated India.
Hello students, we'll continue our study of modern Indian architecture, and today we'll start, which is probably one of the most important segments in the study of modern Indian architecture, and that is an introduction to what is called as critical regionalism. I have mentioned it to you earlier in my previous lectures, where I have said we can also call it as regional modernism, that is modernism that is seen from the eyes of regional architecture, or it's a fusion of regional aspects with modernism, and the term critical regionalism actually refers to that. I believe the term abstract regionalism has also been used for it. By the late 1960s and early 70s, there was a realization that there are limitations with regard to modernism, because modernism, as it spread all over the globe, it tended to have a placeless and rootless identity. It did not have a regional context. So whether you were building in South America or in Europe or Japan or in America, the regional context of the architecture was not there. There is no doubt about it that modernism brought about a revolution in our understanding of architecture, particularly in the industrial society. Buildings that were needed this now were buildings that had to be very functional, that had to be built very quickly, that had to have a new aesthetic which was appropriate for an industrial society of machines and automobiles. So there is no doubt that modernism was and continues to remain a vital foundation on which modern architecture has been built. But this gradually became a very apparent by the 60s and 70s that this lacked a regional identity. Socio-cultural and other regional aspirations of people could not be addressed through the window of modernism. So if you look at this slide again, this is some of the buildings, set of buildings done by Mies van der Rohe, and then these are tall buildings that came up on Marine Drive, Nariman Point in Mumbai, and they also represent the same modernist context. Only thing is that there has been a climatic modification done in these buildings. So instead of being in sleek glass and steel, they have smaller fenestrations, and the facade, the curtain wall is having these small fenestrations. The building is in RCC and glass, but it represents the same form based, functional based model of modernism. The international style in modernism spread throughout the world. So if you have United habitation, we have seen similar examples of brutalism, which was one of the subsets of modernism. We find that in IIT Delhi, we find that in the work of Habib Rahman in the WHO building, we find it in the Bauhaus context being brought into India. This is again an international example of modernism. So it was all across the world. And as you look at these buildings, it's very difficult sometimes to look at the building and place it in a particular regional context. At best, you can place the building in a context if you're able to see that there's a climatic response to that. So, but even then it becomes extremely difficult. So these are some examples of modernist tall buildings. This is the Seagram building, the John Hancock Center, the Liver House, and this is the Trident Hotel and the Air India building in Mumbai. Again, this a very similar architectural language. On the other hand, the parallel movement that arose during that time was postmodernism. This profuse ornamentation and this kind of playfulness that came in buildings, and an eclectic mix of styles that came back again, beginning with the foundational writings of Robert Venturi and his design of the Vana Venturi house for his mother, that he wrote about that, and postmodernism brought out the kind of results that are there in this slide. This, for example, is the Hiranandani apartments by Hafiz Contractor in Mumbai. It does not have a regional context. If you look at the elements that are there in this building, these are derived from classical European elements. It's not an Indian identity. So critical regionalism was an anti-reaction to the placelessness and the rootlessness of modernism, whereas it was also against the impulsive, or rather an anti-reaction against the impulsive ornamentation and individualism that was seen in postmodernism. So, and there is a reason why postmodernism in the most obtuse form that it came up during the time, like for example here in this example, these examples have died out. There is no doubt that postmodernism did bring in a certain new architectural vocabulary in the 70s and 80s and has continued in a certain manner, but these extreme examples of interpretation of classical elements, etc., is no more there. But the same can also be said for what is called as late modernism. There is something called the high-tech style. You can read about it on internet or any books, particularly the works of Richard Rogers, Norman Foster, Renzo Piano, Michael Hopkins, and the works that they did in the initial years. Centre Pompidou is an example. Then Lloyd's of London is an example. There were extreme examples of that kind of high-tech identity, and those also do not exist anymore. In fact, Rogers worked on these two projects, that is the Centre Pompidou along with Piano, and Richard Rogers' partnership was responsible for the Lloyd's of London. But Richard Rogers himself never returned back to that kind of architectural vocabulary of displaying all the services on the outside, the air conditioning pipes, the ventilation ducts, the air electrical lines, etc. He never came back to that vocabulary. Of course, the derivations that he came up with through that study and the others who were of the same domain of high-tech modernism, they did continue it forward, and they are responsible for some of the most iconic buildings today. Shard, for example, is one of them. Other buildings that the New York Times building in New York, etc. There are many other projects that are very, very wonderfully done. Similarly, postmodernism is also mellowed, and it is appearing in a certain context today. So, sorry for digressing, but I just wanted to give you this background so you can understand that there is this global movement also that happened parallelly. So, regional modernism or critical regionalism is a progressive approach to design, in the sense that it merges the global and local language of architecture. Therefore, wherever it comes up or wherever it came up, people were more readily able to identify themselves to this architecture, while at the same time enjoying the functionalism, enjoying the advantages that modernism brought in. So, these are some examples that you see here. This is a work of Raj Rival, B.V. Doshi, and I believe this is by Shirish Berry. So, it is an architecture that is rooted in modernism, no doubt, but it is also tied to the geographical and cultural context. So, we have the works of Tadao Ando in Japan, Alvar Aalto in Finland, I don't have a picture of Louis Barragan in Mexico. So, these architects have also responded to this critical regional response of merging modernism with a regional context. This term specifically was coined by Kenneth Frampton in 1983, and it seeks to balance local aspects with the progressive lessons of modernism. So, let us just look at this example and try to see how Raj Rival in this project for British consular housing, how does he do that? If you see here, this is the work of G.T. Ritweld called the Schrader House in the 1930s, and this is the plan of the Schrader House. Here is a Rajasthani Haveli, and Raj Rival has a very strong subtext of North Indian architecture, a traditional architecture in his buildings, and we will see more about that in subsequent presentations. So, here is the plan of the Haveli. Now, what he has done if you look at the plan, it is a modern plan. So when you enter the building on the ground floor in the courtyard side, here is the front, this is the living room area, and you have the kitchen, and you have the entrance lobby, and you climb up the staircase, and then you have the 3 bedrooms and the toilets on the top. But that's not all there is. So the plan responds to a modern plan like that of the Schrader house. Of course, Schrader house was much more flexible because the walls were movable partitions that could all be opened up and it become one large space. But be as it may, this same kind, a similar kind of planning with fixed walls is what we see in this in this plan. So it's a modernist plan. But when you talk of the terraces that he created, like this terrace that you see here, if you can try to match it with the picture, is the terrace that you see here. This is the terrace that you see here. This small terrace that you see here is somewhere here, and this angan that you see below is here. So he is trying to create these outdoor indoor spaces, and outdoor spaces, because our climate is able to respond well to that. This is something derived from our traditional / vernacular architecture, and the chhatri also appears in his work as an element. This is the modern derivation of the chhatri in Rewal's work, and we will see that in some other of his works also. So this is a modern derivation of the chhatri. So what we find here is that Raj Rewal, who is one of the strongest proponents of critical regionalism in the world, I am not saying India, globally he is recognized as one of the strongest proponents of critical regionalism. He brings that in his works repeatedly. So the aim is to counter the homogeneity of modernist architecture. Look at these examples. It is so difficult for you to place a particular house that you see here in a particular region. The closest that I can come to is this work, because you have seen it already, the Hari Vallabh Das house by A.P. Kanvinde, and because it is much more closed up, it is not having that sheet glass that you find in the other spaces. But if you look at the interior here and you look at the interior here, the only it's both are free flowing spaces. This is India, this is somewhere in the West. So the right balance between this rational approach of modernism, the architectural traditions of a region, the variants of modern architecture with greater respect towards the climate of a region, the topography of the region, its local materials, and its socio-cultural context. All these play a role in creating critical regionalism. These are some of the examples. This, I believe, is the work of Glenn Murcutt in Australia, who is also working with this context. Raj Rewal in India, Tadao Ando, Raj Rewal again, and this is a building in Israel. Now in 1933, Corbusier came up with the idea of it was an urban planning document, the Athens Charter of the Council International de Architecture Moderne. Corbusier came up with this document based on the radiant city design in 1935 that he had come up with, and the urban studies that had been done by Khayyam in the early 1930s. Housing districts were to be designed in a manner that they were the best sites, and there was minimum solar exposure that was required in all the dwellings. For hygiene, the buildings were not to be built along transportation routes, and with regard to modern techniques, we had to construct them as high apartment buildings widely apart, freeing space for large green parks. In fact, there is a story that Corbusier, when he visited New York, he even suggested a similar kind of mechanism. When already New York had already developed, the skyscrapers already there, he was proposing vast green spaces with huge towers, and so there is maximum green space available like that. And there were planning of certain projects done like that, like this one that you see here. You see that these are tall blocks that are kept widely spaced apart, green spaces, concept which is similar to the radiant city or the villa reduce concept of Le Corbusier. But So these are some of the other examples. Even his own project United Habitation, though a singular block, continues to have the same idea of vast green spaces around it. But there was a criticism of this charter. Number one, the emphasis on tall high density housing in green space is a very narrow view with regard to housing. Secondly, it effectively kills research in other areas of urban housing. So the solution by itself is very simplistic and is very restrictive to a certain solutions in a certain situation. Many more solutions are needed. It's a very complex problem. Certain building patterns are universally appropriate, there is no doubt about that at a generic level, but substantial adaptation is required at the local level with keeping in mind the local conditions of that place. There has also been an emergence of environmental behavior studies in architectural education which challenges modernism's narrow definition of function. So today we have moved beyond that. So therefore there was a reason why Corbusier's idea of the radiant city never became a success that he intended it to be. Similarly, it could also be said that F.L. Wright's idea of the broadacre city, where instead of tall buildings he proposed these individual houses or individual dwellings placed in vast green spaces. Because of the automobile they could easily be connected and there would be commercial spaces, etc. Even that did not materialize as a viable city planning mechanism. Now let us now come to the beginning of an understanding of critical regionalism. I would like to take you to the background of what is called as neo-traditional architecture. Now the word neo basically means new. It is a new way of looking at traditional architecture, a new approach to traditional architecture, and in a sense this really defined modern Indian architecture. Architects like Charles Correa, B.V. Doshi, Ashish Ganju, Ranjit Sabiki, Revati Kamath, Raj Rewal, Meenakshi Jain, all of them have been associated with it. So it is a new form of traditional Indian architecture since 1970s. Many architects have looked at how patterns of traditional houses fit into the Indian way of life, and architectural principles regarding patterns of light, shade, interior spaces, exterior masses, all of that has to respond to an Indian context. Many strong modernists also began to lay emphasis on traditional architecture, and though it was not a unified effort like the CIAM, but many of these architects sought inspiration from the vernacular traditions of India. Similarly, there was an Indian attempt, or rather it was a universal attempt, because we can count in Finland and Japan and Mexico and many other countries, to have a unique architectural identity of that region or of that nation. So modern Indian architecture, critical regionalism, is a solution of modern problems using vernacular forms or traditional forms and principles. Architects like Raj Rewal in India, Tadao Ando in Japan, Glenn Murcutt in Australia, and Alvaro Siza in Portugal. Rewal, Tadao Ando, Glenn Murcutt, Alvaro Siza. Now the new tradition itself can be split into 5 parts. Please do not get confused. I will keep on explaining it 3-4 times so that you can get a clear understanding of this division. First is a direct revival of traditional Indian architecture. Second is what will be the focus of our study. It is a combination of modern and traditional architecture, and it is critical regionalism. The third is a vernacular revival. The fourth is what came to be known as, what John Lang coins at, as modern Indian vernacular, and the fifth is community architecture. Now there will be overlaps. A project that I will be bringing about, say for example in one of the above categories, will also be connected for example with the fifth one, that is the community architecture. The revival of traditional Indian architecture. Several Indian architects believed during that time, and continue to believe, because today Vastu Shastra is an important subject being taught in many architectural colleges, that historical texts are a science to base our modern Indian architecture. Texts that provide design principles for the location of buildings, of siting the building on the site and the overall building configuration. The Vastu Purusha Mandala is a mythological basis of these design principles, and these architects and proponents of these Shilpaic traditions reject the basic Bauhaus design principles of functionalism. So it is not that they are rejecting modernism per se in totality, it is just that they are rejecting the direct derivations of Bauhaus. We have seen that in some of the works earlier. So in this revival there is a new look at India's historical roots, the Shastra and the Vastu Purusha Mandala. For example, the K.T. Raghunath house designed in Kerala by K.T. Ravindran. It has a central courtyard. I am so sorry that the plan itself is very small. So this has a central courtyard here, and it is around a modern organic plan. It is not a functional cuboidal geometry. And the courtyard itself is like the Shunya Bindu, that is the intangible void which is also there in the Vastu Purusha Mandala, which represents Brahma. So that is where the Shunya Bindu is represented here in this dwelling. The orientation of this house is governed by local rituals, that is astronomy, and the construction was connected with local traditions. Similarly, the idea of this kind of derivation we see in the works of Charles Correa. Now Charles Correa has not been, he's not totally imbibing into traditional model, because he has taken lessons from different strands. So here in this case he synthesizes modern and historic principles. For example, in Vidhan Bhavan, which is a massive project vis-a-vis the K.T. Raghunath house. So in Bhopal in 1980 to 93, he uses modern principles with the play of solids and voids. So what he does is, and that's a very interesting thing that he does, he creates a number of spaces which are all the functional spaces of the Vidhan Bhavan of Bhopal. But instead of keeping them like that, scattered, put together, solids and voids, he provides them a circular ring around it and kind of connects them all together as one. So we can call it that this is in a sense the ordering principle of the Vidhan Bhavan. There is no doubt about it that when you look at the Vidhan Bhavan as a total form, it reminds you of the Sanchi Stupa. Even the dome at the top is representative of the Sanchi Stupa. But within this framework is the 9 square mandala. The only difference is that he takes artistic or architectural license, that instead of keeping the Shunya Bindu or the void in the middle of this mandala, he actually creates the central hall here, and the major hall right in the middle of the Vidhan Bhavan. On the other hand, though he does take a similar license in the Jawahar Kala Kendra in Jaipur 1986 to 92, but there is a void that has been retained in the center, where we have this space that you see here in this photograph. So this void is there as per the Vastu Purusha Mandala, and instead of 1 square of mandala displaced as in the city plan of Jaipur. Now what Charles Correa is doing is, not only is he responding, not only is he trying to derive something from the traditional text, he is also trying to relate the building to Jaipur as a city. What he does is, he displaces one of the squares here on the southeast corner. I am sorry, on the this will be the southeast corner. But in Jaipur, it was necessitated because of a reason. The topography of the city forced them or compelled them to take this square from here and bring it here. So the square which is on the, it should actually be the northwest, I am sorry, this has been written wrongly, the northwest square has been displaced and shifted to the southeast here. But in the Kala Kendra, only the southeast square has been displaced without displacing any other squares. So again, he does take that artistic liberty in order to be able to create the kind of space he wants within the idea of the regional context and the historical text context. Now let us come to vernacular architecture. I just want to one slide to actually just tell it to you in a very brief way. It is the use of local materials and knowledge, usually without the supervision of professional architects. These are buildings that have been derived empirically by hit and trial method over centuries by the local people of the region. They responded to by building these dwellings or these buildings directly in relation to their climate, their topography, their social cultural value systems, the kind of building technology they had, the kind of materials they had. And this was not designed by any specific designer or architect. Generally these buildings were built by the local mistris or masons. So these are region specific, they are simple and they are practical, and they have their own aesthetic value system which is directly connected to their social cultural value system. Now there is this vernacular revival vis-a-vis vernacular architecture, which is an attempt to revive vernacular architecture in a modern context. So in this case a professional architect does take over, but he uses a similar language. Focus is the provision of a low cost building using local labor, local materials, local construction techniques, and to come up with a building that responds to a vernacular tradition of the region. For example, the work of architects Vasant and Revati Kamath, and the works of Nari Gandhi, the works of K.T. Ravindran. These are two examples of Vasantin. This is Revati Kamath's work, the Lakshman Sagar Resort in Rajasthan in 2010, and this is the Mud School in Bhopal by her in 2016. Charles Correa again has done work with regard to vernacular revival. This was a very early project of 1958 in which, like other certain architects who have experimented with the vernacular in certain situations, Charles Correa has done that in the Delhi Handloom Pavilion 1958. Modern space and structure has been expressed in a vernacular context. Now how modern is it? It's a modern structure having 16 cable supported parasols. As you can see here, these are completely modern structural system, and there is below a space which is very vernacular. It's a central open square. It is a shield. These parasols are a shield from the sun. This is how the space has been created. And then again in the National Crafts Museum in 1975, he uses the same principle of a vernacular revival where he creates a village. A series of buildings and courts with a village center and a temple, etc., is a vernacular type. So what does he do? The other subtext here is, if you remember the study of Gandhi Samarak Sangrahalaya, that was also a vernacular revival in a sense in its space planning, because it was Gandhi's deep attachment to the Indian village that comes out in the Samarak Sangrahalaya. The way the spaces have been organized, the way the modules have been organized, the way the open spaces in between meander across is a typical village with the water body at the center. Now here this also responds to how the great temples were structured earlier around open to sky ceremonial pathways, which is relevant to tropical architecture. So what he did is that the museum is organized around a central pathway. It's not a very clear image, but if you see from here, let's just go back to the earlier plan. You can see this is the plan here, and the central pathway begins from somewhere here and you meander across like this, and this is leading through the exhibits in a sequence. You can go on following the sequence, or you can break at any time and go towards the exhibit to look at it in detail. The end of the sequence, you exit via a roof garden to an amphitheatre, the amphitheatre for folk dances and open air displays. Then again we find the vernacular revival in Belapur housing in Navi Mumbai 1983 to 86, another project by Charles Correa designed on the vernacular village type but with a modern rational approach. It is definitely a village model, but it is designed in a manner that it clearly shows modern functional organization. The spaces have been put together like that. Then we find it in the works of Nari Gandhi, where he designed it as a traditional mistri. Most of the works he did were houses, domestic projects, which avoided, and he avoided drawings and worked directly with craftsmen using materials known to them, and also reflects his association with FLW because these have a very clear reflection of organic architecture. The kind of spaces that he derives are clearly derived from there. I will just swing across quickly because we do not have time, but please do read more about Nari Gandhi and you will understand deeply. Then there is the example of Gerard de Cunha 1992, that is the closest that we have come to an architect designed vernacular complex to maintain a way of life and learning of a traditional dance form. Traditional building forms techniques have been used, primary material stone and thatch have been used, but over time they came to realize that though it does have that clear context, it does look like a traditional vernacular space, as you can see in all these images, but it was neither comfortable nor climatically suitable or climatically comfortable. Therefore, it has evolved into a resort hotel, which I believe is air conditioned, and therefore this final image that you see is now the entrance to this resort hotel. This much greater comfort. So sometimes though the project's the heart is in the right place, the final results may not see us through. Vernacular revival in the works of Vasantin Revati Kamath, again architect designed vernacular buildings, the school for mobile creches 81 to 83, vernacular features like squares, courtyards, domes and construction without shuttering, low cost exposed brick construction, all of that a response to a vernacular revival. Then there is modern Indian vernacular, something that you see in your cities all across the country. This is not an architecture that is designed by prime architects, it is designed by really iconic architects. These are the kind of houses, the kind of buildings that come up in our city because the local mistri or the local contractor has learned how to make these buildings, and he puts together, or even an architect puts together these buildings based on the taste buds of the client. It is arose as a popular middle class taste in India, especially in North India. It is eclectic, having a mixture of elements in it. It is not considered highly by academically leaning architects, but it is widespread and cannot be overlooked without mentioning it. It is an architecture of display. There are two basic types: either you take the elements derived from our past, Hindu, Islamic or colonial, or it can be modernist form derived from even classical elements, Renaissance and other classical elements. These houses, which are profusely there all over the country, you would see them regularly around you or even in the colony or the place where you live. They have sloping concrete shades, they have these sometimes classical order balustrades, pitched Mangalore roofs, large picture windows sometimes facing the west to bring in maximum heat from the west, wearing images of Renaissance, colonial style, Indian traditions. So like the pitched roofs or like the traditional Rajasthani style, all of it appears in these what is called as modern Indian vernacular. It is also akin to postmodernism. So we have these tall buildings in Connaught Place. This is, for example, the Ambadeep Tower by C.P. Kukreja, which in fact is a much more sublime, a much better derivation, closer to critical regionalism. But still the postmodernist facade is there, but it has an efficient modernist plan. Even the houses that I have shown you previously, they still have that free flowing spaces of open living dining spaces connected to open kitchens and lounges, etc. So spaces continue to remain modern, but there is an increasing number of high rise commercial buildings with these standard stylized skins, and one of the important proponents of this style is Hafiz contractor, array of buildings housing with tall domes and decorations from other parts of the world, like one of his most important salient projects, the Hiranandani Gardens in Mumbai, bringing in elements from classical architecture, a strong imprint on Mumbai. He has been heavily criticized, but he captured the imagination of the developers and the ordinary public. He is probably one of the most well-known architects of India today. Like him, reject him, he continues to remain a pop star of architecture with buildings like the Beverley Park, the Seawood Estates, and of course the Hiranandani Gardens in 1987. Other besides Hafiz contractor are also building, and they are generally serving the wealthy. So these are the 5 subsets that we have seen today. In the next class, or rather the 4 that we have seen today, in the next session, I will talk about community architecture, which is very important for you to understand. Maybe it is not so prevalent today, and then we will come down to some of the basic context of critical regionalism. Thank you.